A great interview with Jaeson Jones coming up in a moment. For those of you in the UK, Jason is a wealth of knowledge and experience looking at the border, the US border, the southern border. And we discussed the whole area of transnational crime, people trafficking of the border and why it's not completely shut, the demand for drugs and drug cartels operating from Mexico across there. I mean, so much, and most of it I had no idea about. So I certainly learned a lot listening to him. Jason brings a wealth of knowledge from his background on the border, overseeing the border control on the Texas border. And I think over the last 2 or 3 years, he's now left that and gone public to try and highlight the failings in the system, to try and highlight the drug cartels and how this can be fixed, because this is a massive problem that affects and blights millions of people's lives. And it needs to be fixed. And Jason ends looking at solutions and looking how you fix this problem. So it's not all doom and gloom, but actually we do end looking at a positive note. So I know you will enjoy this interview as much as I did. And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you once again for joining us. And we are once again going across the pond over stateside to the US. And it's absolutely wonderful to have Jaeson Jones join us today. Jason, thank you for your time.
Peter, it's good to be with you, man. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. We're going to look at a subject we haven't really looked at before at all, which is your porous, completely open border there on the southern part of the US along Mexico. But before we start, you can obviously, Jason's website is up there, jasonjones.com. And I absolutely love the video you have at the front of that helicopter. I would happily go up with you in that helicopter, that video you have. So it gets the juices flowing and enthusiasm about the subject simply from looking at that video for the first 10 seconds. So it's really well done. But Jason, we want to talk about the issue on the border, immigration, open border, and how it affects kind of people trafficking and the drugs issue you have there. But maybe we can just go back a little bit and your background of, I think, on your website, retired captain from the Texas Department of Public Safety, Intelligence, and Counterterrorism Division. That is a mouthful. You manage the daily operations for the Texas Rangers Border Security Operations Center. And there's a lot in that, but maybe how did you come to be involved in the whole area of security, border control? What kind of got you into that initially as a career?
Sure. My stepfather was a Houston police officer. He was a detective there. And when he retired, he moved to the Hill Country. And I can tell you, since I was about 7 or 8 years old, I knew I was going to be in law enforcement. And that's exactly really what happened right out of high school. I went to work for the Hays County Sheriff's Department, which is a sheriff's department pretty much in central Texas. And then went to the state police, which is the Texas Department of Public Safety, moved 9 different times across the state of Texas, including was stationed in El Paso as a highway patrolman, including 1,290 miles to the other side of that border in Brownsville, Texas, as an undercover narcotics agent. I spent most of my time in the clandestine services. And I led 2 major drug squads in Laredo, Texas, as the war as the Los Zetas and Cartel de Golfo broke out, and we had that spillover violence coming in. And then finally made my way back to headquarters and managed one of the largest fusion centers in the country at the Texas Fusion Center. And then from there, commanded the Texas Rangers Border Security Operations Center. And I've got to tell you, Peter, I was so frustrated in 2016 at what was happening in Mexico to Mexican citizens and to migrants, and how these cartels were absolutely just killing them. So what happened to me is that, I was commanding operations with the Cross-Border Operations Center of the Texas Rangers Border Security Operations Center, and building programs to try to help save lives in Mexico before these cartels were doing such horrific things to Mexican citizens and to migrants, that I retired and went public and decided that if we didn't fix this problem, that exactly what we're seeing now today was going to come here. And I've been exactly right. I mean, it didn't take any rocket scientists to figure out that what was happening in Mexico was going to come here if we did not secure the southwest border. And if you look at the level of spillover violence and the murders that have been taking place in the United States and the level of failure of fentanyl, I can tell you, I know these cartels very, very well. They will not stop until they are stopped. And it's going to take outside forces to come in and do it. And I can tell you that as somebody that has sat down with leadership of these cartels, who has debriefed them, who has had them working for me within law enforcement to try to, help save lives in Mexico, they will tell you that they're out of control and that they've got to be stopped.
So tell us why you went public. You're working there as part of the the barrier, the force to protect the southern U.S. border. And why was it something specific that pushed you to then say, I need to now inform the public of what is happening?
Well, I was in a very unique position. I mean, Washington is pretty far from the border, and we've trained a lot of federal agencies on what
Yeah.
was taking place. And what really happened here, Peter, that most Americans are not even aware of, never mind people on the other side of the planet, is that the Mexican cartels are not drug trafficking organizations anymore. That's something they do. It is not what they are. They have migrated from 2006 from what they really were, which was organized crime. And then as President Calderon in Mexico began using their military to go after them, that's where the insurgency started in 2006. From there, as the Los Zetas, a very hyper-violent cartel who were special forces, former special forces, many of them in the beginning, evolved. They fell into terrorism, as you saw the mass murders being committed in Mexico, like San Fernando, where they killed 72 migrants, Allende, where they killed 300 men, women, and children, cut them into pieces, and then burned them to ash, known as what is a guiso, where it's a process in which they kill people and then dissolve the bodies. Or where we see them today, where they went from terrorism directly into a parallel government. So the way we look at them today and we categorize them is that they're truly a parallel government in Mexico. And it's not a US Mexico problem, as you hear from most so-called experts who read a lot, who've never sat down and talked to them. Sinaloa cartel is in 54 countries around the world. Cartel Jalisco New Generation is in over 48. So this is not a US Mexico problem. They are a global problem, and they truly are terrorist organizations, and we need to treat them based on their actions, what they're doing in Mexico, and what they're doing to people all over the world, not just the United States.
Well, I want to go down the discussing the drug side, but I think to start off with the actual border, you have a very long border across deserts. Here in the UK, we're an island, and that should provide us with a level of natural protection. If only our government actually wanted to use that well. But over there, you have got a huge border, obviously with Canada, Mexico. Mexico's the one that seems to be causing the US most trouble. But tell us, when you look at the current situation, as someone who's been there on the ground, what are your thoughts on how it's kind of got to this stage where it is, where you have such a porous border?
Sure, and I think it's a great question. So of the 2,000 miles along the southern border, Texas has 1,290 of it.
Wow.
But you hear the term that the cartels have operational control of the southern border of the United States. If you notice, though, these pundits never tell you how they have operational control and what has happened. What you mostly hear from the media is that this is an immigration issue. That's not a lie either, but it's one layer of multiple layers that are impacting the United States as a direct result of the failure to secure the southwest border. What the cartels do very well is they utilize a network known as the Halcon Network or Falcon or Lookout Network. And I can tell you, as somebody that knows how these networks work very well, they check on and off just like law enforcement. Some work 8 hours, some work 10 hours, some work 12-hour shifts. And they use two-way handheld encrypted radios, or they'll use cell phones with encrypted apps, and they communicate to what is known as Central. Central would be like their command post. Some are mobile, some are stationary, depending upon which cartel you're talking about. But they are operating in South Texas. I've seen them as far as 30 miles into the country. In Arizona, where I am right now, I'm just outside of Scottsdale. I've seen them, as far as 50 miles into the United States. And that is how they control that southwest border, so that when there's no law enforcement present, They shoot the gap with whatever commodity they want. Now, commodities today can be everything from men, women, and children. It can be weapons going south. It can be ammunition going south, or it can be drugs moving north. But the movement and flow of goods in what they call a gate meaning that whichever group or whichever Halcon network is controlling certain gates, they'll say this gate is open, this gate is shut. And they treat it just like that on the radios when they're talking. And I can tell you that as somebody that's monitored these radios for many, many years. That is how they have operational control. The problem is most people are not aware of it. So then from that, that is why they fight for control of the plazas and the municipalities on the Mexico side, because if you control that space on the Mexico side, then you can control the gates along the border. And that's why the cartels battle in Mexico for control of those different plazas, because then you have control of all commodities, illicit and legitimate, that move through those zones.
So is it impossible for the Mexican government to actually get a grip? You've seen different administrations and always said we're going to clamp down, as over in Colombia as well. And it's a lot of talk. And then you read about all these people suddenly losing their lives, getting shot. And you think, actually, is it worth it? So, I mean, when you look at over the border into Mexico, how is it possible, I guess, for the politicians to actually change it?
Well, it's a great question. But if we were sitting down right now and you and I were talking to a cartel boss and we said to him, what is the difference between the Mexican government and the cartels? They would laugh and they would say, there is no difference. It's one and the same, because the level of corruption has gotten so high within the Mexican government now that's why you see the AMLO administration under the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, working side by side with them. Look, no one wants to have these conversations and say it publicly to the American people, because it doesn't look good that one of our number one trading partners, which is Mexico, just to the south of us, has fallen to, they're a narco state at this point. And that's the real truth of it. If you look at the last national election that happened in Mexico, they had 132 murders of people who were elected officials, people who were running for office, or staffers.
Wow.
You can look that up. It's publicly, it's well knowledgeable, but yet that's not communicated. The other problem you have is that it's not real smart to report about what's happening in Mexico, because look at the amount of journalists that are executed and killed.
Yeah.
So, we've got to have a real honest conversation, not only as Americans, news media, but people all over the world, as to what these cartels are doing. Because I'll be very frank with you, if anyone's watching from the UK right now and you're thinking you're immune, you are not. These cartels are operating all over the world.
It kind of seems as though our governments have accepted that this is just part of the world today. I mean, I couldn't believe it whenever I was over stateside first time in many years back in April, and going to LA and seeing people just lying all over the footpaths, and seeing a problem which is out of control. And when I saw it for the first time, it made me quite angry that that's the situation. But is there a lack of anger? Is there just an acceptance of this as part of life now?
Well, I think it's a great point and a great question. One of the real issues that we have is that the immigration issue has been so, it's been such a headbutting issue in the United States for 40 plus years, right? That immigration layer has masked all of the other index crimes impacting Americans for too long. And it has become the ideology that if you talk about the border, that immediately you're talking about immigration. Well, let's just say the immigration issue is fixed for a second for the United States. Let's just take immigration out of it. You are still stuck with terrorists crossing the southwest border. In the last year, 137, by the way, known terrorists to have crossed the southern border into the United States. You're still stuck with fentanyl. You are still stuck with the impact of transnational crime, methamphetamine, weapons trafficking, money laundering, extortion. I mean, the list goes on. But in the national media, it doesn't hit the narrative of, what a certain politician wants to believe. And I will be very frank with you. Whether you are Republican in the United States or Democrat, they all look at the border through the lens of immigration. And I can tell you that as somebody that meets with them privately, because most of them are being briefed by whatever news they're watching. Because one of the first questions I ask, just so you know, Peter, is when I meet with these folks now, I say, When was the last time you were briefed, either classified or unclassified, by the U.S. intelligence agencies or law enforcement? You'd be stunned. Most of them have never been briefed on what is happening with the cartels and the impact of transnational crime. And so that's why you are feeling, and the world is hearing about how the United States is being overrun with poisonings from fentanyl directly linked to two major cartels, the Sinaloans and the Cartel Jalisco New Generation.
It is. I think it's also part of the problem. I guess, glorification of the industry. I mean, um, I really enjoyed watching Breaking Bad on Netflix. I
And
watched Narcos on Netflix, and it seems that a level of glamorizing something which is brutal and destroying whole countries is that part of the problem, that maybe again the public don't see it as a real issue.
I think it's a great point. The cartel's propaganda machines are absolutely incredible. And
Mm.
I've watched Narcos. It's a good show, but I also think of the men, women, and children who have been brutally killed by these monsters, and I truly call them that. And to call them an animal, animals don't do what they do to people, where they burn their faces off while they're alive, where they cut their heads off with chainsaws or dull knives, where they cut their heart out of their chest and then eat it. I could tell you stories of things that I've seen that these animals have done, and it's exactly why when I retired from law enforcement, I began trying to get them designated as foreign terrorist organizations and to focus the United States toward what this problem really is at the southwest border, much broader than just the lens of immigration. Because I will tell you, there's been a clandestine war going on down there for a very long time. And this is all coming out. I mean, that's the great thing about the natural course of time. Truth still matters, and truth is eventually revealed. And what has been hidden from the American public, what's been hidden from the Mexican citizens, and they have been impacted way more than Americans in many ways. I don't know if a lot of folks in the UK are aware. Mexican citizens since 2006 have lost over 340,000 of their citizens to these cartels. Think of that. So, I watch these shows like Narcos, and I see the glamorization of these crooks and these people, and they are monsters, and they need to be dealt with, and they are going to be dealt with. And let me tell you, it's going to be a dark day for them, because eventually the countries of the world are going to unite, and the very best of the best are coming for them for what they've done to so many people.
When you said there should be designated terrorist organizations, how at the moment is it simply that? I mean, how are they viewed? How are they designated? How are they seen within, I guess, U.S. law enforcement and the country if they're not regarded as terrorists?
Well, that's the problem. They're looked upon as criminals because we've been dealing with the cartels through a drug nexus only, prior to fentanyl, mostly marijuana. You got to remember, most of these guys were marijuana traffickers 3 decades ago, and then they got into cocaine, heroin, and other things. But at the end of the day, the level of violence and the level of control, they were organized crime. The problem is that this evolution that I walked you through a little while ago, where they went from organized crime into an insurgency, into terrorism, and then into where we see them today as a parallel government, has even in the United States not really been quite understood. And so we still look at the border through the lens of immigration and as a a marijuana drug trafficking problem. Well, as we legalize marijuana, the cartels adjusted. And that's exactly why they got into fentanyl. I don't know how it is in the UK, but I can tell you in the United States, fentanyl was never an issue in this country until 2015. Why? Because China began pushing fentanyl into the US via the mail service. When the cartel saw a gap there, they began getting chemical precursors sent into Mexico. They were already doing that, working with China for methamphetamine. The Sinaloans had taken over the meth market. Then CJ&G took over getting chemical precursors sent. And then what did the Sinaloans do? They adjusted, began getting 4A NPP and NPP sent from China, began creating the pill mills in Mexico, and then pushing deadly fentanyl. And if you look at how they've weaponized fentanyl today, they truly have weaponized it. It's gone from regular fentanyl now to parafentanyl, and now where we see it as serafentanyl. And for the folks that are watching, in order to make those changes, you have to change the analogs and the production model of it. And they hired chemists, Sinaloans specifically, right out of different universities to run their labs to change the analogs to make more deadly strains and levels of fentanyl. So, these are the stories that mostly have not gotten out. And so when we talk about the weaponization of fentanyl on the American people and really on Mexican citizens and many other nations around the world, the Sinaloans are responsible for that change. And yet, what have we done to go after them to fix this? Nothing. What is the United States government and other governments doing to hold the Mexican government accountable? Very little, if anything. And you know that because you're not hearing about their labs being hit all over the country of Mexico.
And are there stories about countries you think of, Colombia also being extremely big in the drug industry, but I guess Mexico has an advantage with a customer next door. But what when you look at other countries, are there other countries in Latin and South America that have had this issue but have managed to, I guess, defeat it so it's no longer a blight on their economy?
I wouldn't say they've completely defeated it. You know, I think that transnational crime evolves, and we've seen that evolution, not just in Mexico, but throughout Central and South America as well. I'll give you a great example of that. Um, the drug trade is one part of it, right? This
Mhm.
adjustment that we have seen as a result of this mass migration in the United States has driven what was human smuggling into the realm of human trafficking at unprecedented levels. So like any criminal underworld, they will evolve to whatever's going to make them money. And so we're
Yeah.
seeing massive pivots and changes like we've never seen from not only drug trafficking, where they're moving and changing the analogs of fentanyl and into this new world like xylazine and other drugs that most even Americans are not familiar with that are emerging and coming online. But then the adjustment from smuggling, so just so the folks know that are watching, smuggling is where you have an agreement between a person and a smuggler to be moved voluntarily from point A to point B, right? So I pay you for that transaction and you move me from here to there. Within the human trafficking world, most folks are familiar with the commercial sex part of it, but there are two other parts of that, and that's forced labor and debt bondage.
Mm.
Well, many of these smugglers now are charging such extraordinary fees on migrants that, what used to cost $50 to $100 to be moved from point A to point B now may cost you thousands, if not tens
Wow.
of thousands. So, well, none of these migrants have that money. So now they're indebted to a criminal organization in a foreign country for years to come. When this all comes out, and it's going to, I mean, at the end of the day, these kind of tectonic shifts can't be masked. And so in the United States, we've had 863,000 people in the last 3 months. Let me say that again. 863,000 people encountered just by U.S. Customs and Border Protection coming into the United States. We're going to see a shift within the human smuggling to the trafficking of people like this country has never seen. And I truly call it America's new slave trade because that's where we are.
When you've got those numbers, and as much as I want to kick the Democrats, this is I want to talk about the issue, not about the politics. But when you've got politicians that seem to think this is wonderful, the more people, the better, and they don't seem to be aware of the misery that's involved, and for some reason they think this is a positive issue. And it's not simple. This isn't about people fleeing war, like the argument in the UK, people coming from Syria or the Middle
Yeah,
East. It's
yeah.
economic, and that's plain to see. So why is there not the anger amongst politicians of, I guess, the injustice that's happening, and why are they promoting it and encouraging it to such a scale?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely right. Despite all the politics of what's being said, most of the migrants that are coming are economic migrants. They've made it to where if you want to come to the United States, you can come here, with exception of 4 countries right now. So the world has heard that. The long haul smugglers, the alien smuggling organizations, and the Mexican cartels from the border all the way around the world are pushing out on social media. If you want to go to the United States, now's your time. So that calling has gone out, and folks are coming in, and you see it in the data. So there's one part of it. The other issue you have is that this is the criminal underworld, right? And they don't illuminate those crimes until those crimes are illuminated. So now you've got a very large scale part of the national media that doesn't want to cover it. And those of us that do want to cover it, it's very difficult. You have to partner with law enforcement. You have to be able to understand what law enforcement is dealing with and have approval to embed with them, to illuminate it, to get it out. And that's what I do. My background being in law enforcement, understanding how these cartels and these smugglers operate. I never planned on being a journalist. That was never part of the vision. My goal was to change U.S. policy to save lives. That's still my vision. So what I do now as a journalist is I go out and I embed with law enforcement and I show what those men and women are going through and what they're dealing with, which is exactly why we're able to really get down there and show you the level of human smuggling, trafficking, and drug trafficking that's taking place. Because, I'm a firm believer, if we tell people something of what's happening, we've all been lied to across the board for so long. But if I go down there and I show it to you, then you can see it yourself and believe it.
It kind of seems that the cartels are always one step ahead. I mean, is it true that the authorities are basically permanently playing catch up?
Well, let's talk about what is a cartel, first of all, because I think this is going to stun a lot of your viewers. Most people think that a cartel is a drug trafficking organization or that they're a gang. And you need to know that when you hear the term that the cartels are a gang, that immediately that so-called professor or academia person who has all this experience knows nothing of them. They are not a gang. I want to be very clear on that. What a cartel is and what cartel means is agreement. The problem is, Peter, it's been bastardized. And so those criminal underworld groups who are able to bring more and more of them together become very large. Sinaloans, for example, if you looked at the different groups that are a part of the Sinaloa cartel, you'd be stunned. It is not one cell, one criminal organization. It is generational families. It is different groups in the United States, different groups all over that make up the Sinaloa cartel. So these organizations are very large, thousands of them. And they have lawyers, they have accountants, they are run like a company. And if we were sitting down with them right now, Peter, and we were talking to them, they would not say, our cartel this and our cartel that. That's what Americans call them. And that's what the news media and, different shows like to say. They call it the company. Yeah. And when you sit down and you talk to them about the level of violence that is happening in their country right now, they'll say, man, we need to get back to business and we need to get back to the company. That's how they talk about it. But they also know that now that is too far gone because the level of enforcement wings that they have to stop their rivals, that this thing's just gotten too far out of control.
What does it bring money into those countries? I'm thinking that this becomes kind of the economy for the country. Does it then benefit? Is that regarded as, well, you don't have tourism, but hey, you've got drugs and that brings in something? Is that completely missing the point, or is that part of the equation?
I think it's part of the equation today because there's so much dirty money now flowing into Mexico, not only through recidivism of people who have come through the country, but the takeover and the amount of money of human smuggling they're making, the trafficking of people they're making, the drug trafficking. I mean, the criminal underworld. When we talk about the Mexican cartels today, you can't compare Colombia to them today. You can't compare what's happening in some of these countries in Central America. They are the most dominant figures. And I say it publicly all the time. I say it privately. What the people of the United States are witnessing is the largest U.S. intelligence failure since 9/11. Peter, I'll say it again, and I will say it until the U.S. intelligence agencies know that their failure is going to be identified day in, day out. These are people that I worked with for a very long time and who I hold a lot of respect for. But we have to be very frank and very honest that they have failed, and they have failed incredibly to the American people. When we can lose 100,000 citizens to deadly fentanyl, and the American public has no idea how this happened, there are many reasons for it. But when there's not a terrorist organization in the world that has killed that many Americans, never mind Mexican citizens, never mind people all over the world. And I warn leaders of countries all the time, from Russia to the UK. I'll tell you a great story. In 2016, I met with the head of Europol, and this directly impacts your audience. And I was in New York. I was at an intelligence conference, and Mr. Rainwater was there, who used to be the head of Europol. And he asked for a briefing on the Mexican cartels. And they said, well, hell, they said, sir, we have the guy here. And he said, Jason's here. He commands the Rangers Border Security Operations Center. And I'd worked very closely with NYPD Intelligence Division at the time under Commissioner Ray Kelly. And so they asked, hey, would I mind briefing Mr. Rainwater on the cartels? I said, absolutely. So we went away and we had a briefing privately. And I'll never forget this the rest of my life, Peter. He said to me, he says, Jason, do you know why I requested this briefing? And I said, no, sir. He said, because when we see violence in Europe directly linked to drug trafficking, it's usually involving the Mexican cartels with that violence. And at that point, I knew that drugs were coming to you guys. I knew that it was pouring into the UK. What I didn't know is that violence was also being associated there as we were seeing here. And just so everyone knows, that was at the end of 2016, a few months before I retired. So it's an example of how long this has been taking place and how long this has been occurring.
Obviously, having a secure border is not the, I mean, you got demand as well, but complain about the Democrats increasing that demand. The issue is in Texas, supposedly a Republican state, and if that's on your border, if that's the threat you face, then you do whatever. It's irrelevant who's in the White House. That's your state, and if you're a Republican governor or Republican Senate, Republican House, and you want strong borders, then you'll do that. Why has that not happened in Texas?
Well, there are many reasons why this transnational problem has been able to amass the way it has, and I truly mean that. It's one of, never mind the ideology part of the immigration issue. There's a whole nother problem, and that is that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, has utilized a system known as the Uniform Crime Report. And it captures murder, it captures manslaughter, it captures theft, robbery, burglary, and sexual assault. About 8, what we call 8 index crimes. And you say, well, hell, that kind of covers it, right? Well, everything you and I discuss today, Peter, drug trafficking. In the United States, we've been in a supposed war on drug trafficking for 60 years, yet amongst 18,000 law enforcement agencies, we don't collect how much narcotics is seized. Extortions, public corruption, money laundering, weapons trafficking, ammunition trafficking. I mean, and the list goes on. Transnational crime of itself. And I don't know how the UK, whether you guys are tracking transnational crime as well, but that's been our problem. So if we have a murder in the United States directly linked to the cartels, it's not linked to a cartel, it's linked to a murder that occurred. So we at least capture it, but we don't capture it to transnational crime. So all the other things that I've talked to you about today is part of the masking that's been allowed to take place. Where we, in the United States, we blame Republicans, we blame Democrats. At the end of the day, if you can't get the little things right, you are never going to get the big things right. And we are working like we did in the 1960s and not looking at the impacts of transnational crime. So people aren't lying, in fairness, Peter. When I was going to Washington and dealing with the intelligence agency, sitting down at the Reagan building in CBP headquarters, dealing with these leaders, and I would say, man, we've got problems on the southwest border. And you've heard from all the governors, you've heard from all of the different sheriffs, you've heard from all of the different law enforcement leaders along the border region, and they're all screaming. And the people in the north are saying, we hear you, but we don't see it. They weren't lying either, Peter. What was happening is that the data collected by the Uniform Crime Reporting System and the failure of the FBI leadership is what was validating to them that crime was not rising. Yet on the border, we were feeling it in our communities. So that system of not capturing or having the ability to capture the impacts of transnational crime has been a major player in what has been allowed to happen to the American people. Then you overlay that with the failure of the media to do their job. And I'll just be very frank with you, as somebody who's a part of the media today, you know, there's a lot of failures there as well. So that's a big part of what's taking place. I can tell you this from the Texas side to answer your question specifically to Texas. Texas has a system known as the Unified Command. I helped build it. I know it very well. And it's why Texas law enforcement under Operation Lone Star and Governor Abbott have been able to acquire $4 billion to hold the line at the border with 12,000 Texas National Guardsmen deployed, along with Texas Department of Public Safety and many other state and local agencies. But the issue is we're looking at it through the lens of immigration. They're not stopping immigration, but they are stopping the pursuits, the bailouts, the drug trafficking. I mean, they're working that very vigorously. And when you work the border like I do, and I'm down here every other week, whether I'm in Arizona, whether I'm in Texas, wherever I am, what I can tell you is that if you go to Texas and you see the unified command working, you see it, you feel it, and you can sense how they're holding that line at the border for crimes against the state, okay, not immigration. When you come to Arizona, you can be 100+ miles into this state and you can see the level of trafficking of drugs, the level of trafficking of people. Or when you drive down Interstate 10 and you make a traffic stop riding with these great law enforcement officers out here, because they don't have a unified command trying to hold the border, you feel that impact 100 miles into the country. It's really there. I mean, you do see it, but you don't hear that in the media very often.
Wow. Yeah, I do want to end off on looking at fixing the problem and solution, but kind of one other question before I end on that is, there's been a big focus on the war against terror, supposed war against terror, looking at Islamic terrorism. Has that deflected attention and meant that the war on drugs hasn't really been as well financed, hasn't really been as well fought, hasn't been thought through because the focus has been elsewhere?
You know, I think if you go back to 2009 to 2012, when we were watching the Zetas become so hyper violent, I would absolutely say that that's the case, because at that point, the world was focused on Middle East terrorism, right?
Yeah.
Well, the world evolves, problems evolve, and you don't get the problem you want, you get the problem that you get hit with. And I was on the ground fighting this problem as nations all over the world were focused on the Middle East. And I don't take anything away from that. We had problems there, right? But when you look at the transition of what these cartels have become, the government did not transition. That's the truth of it. And so if you remember back in 2019, when President Trump said, we are going to go after these cartels and we're going to designate them as foreign terrorist organizations, the U.S. intelligence agencies immediately stood up and said, oh, no, we can't do that. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DEA, everybody said, oh, no, we can't do that. Because why? They're all worried about, if you designate them as terrorists, who's going to get the budget? Who's going to get the money for that? Who's going to have the authority to go after them? Well, if you push it from narco drug trafficking into terrorism, well, that's the FBI's model, not the DEA. And who's dominant in Mexico under the federal agencies? It's DEA. Look, I love the men and women of DEA. I'm not bashing them. I've worked side by side with them my whole career. Some of my closest friends are there. But I'm sorry, you get the fight that comes, and what impacts the American people and impacts the nation, you don't get the fight you want. And look, I will tell you, I don't hold back anymore. The institutionalized cowardice and failures of leaders in Washington within the Homeland Security enterprise, that's a world where I come from. I criticize the hell out of them, Peter, and I do it because they're failing the American people. We should have made tectonic shifts in the United States. We didn't do it, and as a result, you've had 100,000 Americans. And I'm down here meeting with families. I just met with 4 moms, angel moms, who lost their children. I don't care about these agencies. We can change them. They exist to protect the American people. If they're not going to change, then we will change them. That's how hardcore I'm becoming on this. What has happened is unacceptable in the United States.
Can I move just to look at fixing this? There must be solutions to this. There must be ideas that you have, discussions you have. So when you're looking at actually fixing this problem, what kind of solutions do you see that need to be worked through and worked out?
Well, there's 2 major ones. Well, really 3. Let's go with the short run first, to save lives. And I have said it publicly, I say it privately, and I say it every day. And that is, we have got to hit the labs, and we've got to hit the labs right now, because in the short run, Peter, to save lives, these labs are massive. They're able to produce thousands of pounds of methamphetamine. They're able to produce millions of pills of deadly fentanyl. And by hitting those labs, we can reduce that supply very rapidly, very quickly. So that's the short win there. And you do that through working with the government of Mexico side by side. And I can tell you that as somebody who has built those programs so that we can have intelligence to drive those operations. By the way, we know where the labs are. That's simple. That's a phone call. That ought to tell you the level of failure happening right now. Second, and very important, is that we have to fix the failed uniform crime reporting system. If a nation cannot understand the impact of transnational crime, how can you focus resources and money of the taxpayers in the right angle to fix a problem? You can't. So we have to fix that as well. But the biggest thing we've got to do for the long run is designate these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And I'm going to tell you why, as the guy that started this entire adventure in 2017. That's how long I've been at this. First, you get three major things out of it. In the United States, we have what's known as the Fourth Amendment, right? To unreasonable searches and seizures. Our system moves very slow by design. We want it that way in the United States, and make sure that every T is crossed, every I is dotted if we're going to be investigated by our government. But with the terrorism designation, if you are a terrorist, you can't be in the United States. Many of the cartel members that are here, and by the way, we have tens of thousands of them, are here on a legal status because they have money. So they are here on a visa. If you're a terrorist, I can revoke your visa. I can send agents out, pick you up, and you are out of my country. I'm adding speed to the system now. Now I'm not working a 2-year case, spending tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars or more to get you, arrest you, and then put you in our jails for years to come. Second, if you are a part of a terrorist organization, I limit your mobility. Now you're not flying international. Now you're not getting on boats to move internationally. So I'm limiting your mobility globally, right? And then third and finally, and you hear this all the time from these so-called experts, it just drives me batshit crazy, I'm going to be honest with you. And they say, we've got to go after their money. And it sounds good. Here's what they don't tell you. We've been doing that for 20 plus years, Peter.
Yeah.
The problem is the system as an investigator moves very slow by design. If I get the terrorism designation outside the United States, not domestically, outside the United States, now I can freeze their assets and I can come for them real time. And you would be stunned at the speed with which transnational crime moves. Now I seize their assets, I take everything from them, and then we come for them. Now I don't go into network theory. What we did previously under law enforcement is we went after the bosses, the capo. They call it the capo theory. And under the Calderon administration and the Nieto administration, that's how we went after them, using law enforcement tactics. With the terrorism designation, we're going to use network theory. And what the network theory, I don't go into it a lot for security purposes, but what I will tell you is that every cartel is a different type of network. Some are hubs, some are spokes, some are wheels, or just broke up mesh networks. And you go after the key nodes within that network. So what that basically means, without going into too much detail, is that we're going to come in and we're going to take everything from the cartel leadership, not them first. And when we take everything from them, just like they did so many families in the United States, so many families in Mexico, then we're coming for them. That's how you win.
I guess that needs money, and it's easier to spend money on a local hospital or school, which is seen by the public and helps you in your election campaign. That's better politically than it is putting money here where it's unseen. Is that part of the problem, lack of financing, or is it purely a lack of organization and joined up thinking?
Well, the U.S. State Department is responsible for the designation. The Western Hemisphere leadership need to absolutely be fired for what they have done to the American public and for refusing to designate these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations because of the Mexican government. So it's much bigger than a political issue, to be quite honest with you. There's a lot of changes that are coming to Washington and these federal agencies who have refused to do what needs to be done. I will tell you there's also a real lack of understanding of what's taking place in Mexico, but it is coming, and I can tell you it's going to change. And it won't be immigration, believe it or not, that's impacting the American people. It will be the overdose deaths of fentanyl and methamphetamine and xylazine, which is coming online right now. The impact of fentanyl to the American public is impacting people in the north. So if you're in Washington, you feel that impact from the border right now much more than you do this human smuggling, human trafficking, like we do in the South. But the North is going to feel that as well. And it will be the deaths of Americans that's going to drive the terrorism designation of what we're going to do to end the cartels.
I think on that, Jason, we'll bring it to a close. I really do appreciate your time coming along and talking to us about a subject that we haven't, don't think, touched on before. So I do appreciate your time today.
Yeah, Peter, it's great to be with you. And I just want to close with one last thing, and that is to all the folks that are watching this. Don't let anyone tell you for a second that this isn't fixable. This is absolutely fixable. And as somebody that has been stationed on that border, somebody who has built programs to go after them, we know exactly how to do it. The problem is we just haven't had the will, and we haven't had the leadership to get it done, but it's coming. Peter, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you today.
Oh, thank you. Good to end on a positive as well, as sometimes these issues can seem too big, and it's good to realize there is a way through it. Just for our viewers and listeners, as we finish, the link there is on the screen, jasonjones.com. Go to his website, and on the top right, you'll see all the links to different social media. So pick your social media of choice and make sure and follow Jason and be informed on this. All the links are in the description for those listening on Podbean or the podcasting apps. Everything is available in the description. So have a look, click on it, and follow those links. And thank you to you watching at home or for listening. Great to have you with us, and we will be back with you very soon with another interview. So thank you for your time, and goodbye.